What if I told you that the most powerful banking system in the world isn't even a bank? What if I told you that the global economy, the markets, governments, and even central banks are quietly controlled by something that works in the shadows? A financial empire that holds nearly $100 trillion, yet average people don't even know it exists. This hidden network moves money across continents. It builds corporations, it funds governments, and sometimes it even destroys economies. But no one sees it happening because it's not regulated like banks. It's not monitored like banks. And it doesn't even follow the rules banks must obey. This is the world of shadow banking, a system that operates outside traditional laws, but inside every part of the global economy. And today, you are about to understand the most powerful invisible empire on Earth. Section 1. What exactly is shadow banking? Shadow banking doesn't mean illegal banking. Shadow banking means banking without limits. It means financial institutions that behave like banks, but are not treated as banks by the law. No branches, no savings accounts, no government-protected deposits, no mandatory reserves. Yet they lend more money than the world's biggest banks. They invest more money than global governments. And they influence markets more than central banks. Shadow banking includes hedge funds, private credit firms, asset management companies, money market funds, securitization vehicles, repo lenders, and many investment firms you've never heard of. They don't take deposits. They don't face strict regulations. But they handle tens of trillions of dollars. Essentially, they are the banks of the banks. The financial giants behind the scenes, the real lenders when traditional banks step back. This is why they are called shadow banks. Not because they are hidden, but because the rules don't touch them. Section 2. The origin of the shadow system. To understand where shadow banking came from, we must go back to 2008. In 2008, the world faced the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Banks failed, stock markets crashed, people lost homes, companies collapsed. During this chaos, governments decided banks needed strict controls, so they introduced tough regulations, higher capital requirements, lower risk limits, more audits, more transparency. But something unexpected happened. Banks became safer but also slower. They could no longer lend money easily, they couldn't take big risks, they couldn't give fast loans to companies, and they couldn't move huge amounts of capital across borders quickly. So the world quietly shifted to a different option. An option with no heavy rules, no restrictions, no limits. Shadow lenders. Corporations began borrowing from shadow banks. Governments began borrowing from shadow banks. Real estate developers began borrowing from shadow banks. By 2010, shadow banking had already exploded. By 2015, it became larger than the US banking system. By 2020, it crossed $52 trillion. And today, estimates say it has reached almost $100 trillion, which makes it one of the largest financial networks ever created. This explosion wasn't accidental. It was a direct response to the global banking system becoming slower and safer. So the world switched to a system that was faster, but much more dangerous. Section 3. How shadow banking controls global finance. Shadow banking controls the world in 4 major ways, each one more powerful than the last. 1. It creates money without printing it. Banks create money by giving loans. Shadow banks create money like assets without restrictions. Through securitization, through synthetic products, through repurchase agreements, through leverage. These instruments act like money. Even though they are not money, they can be traded instantly, used as collateral, and multiplied hundreds of times. This expands the world's financial system massively, but it also increases instability. 2. It funds governments when banks can't. Countries like India, Brazil, Turkey, Italy, and many more rely on shadow lenders. Because shadow lenders move fast, they take risks. They don't need approval from central banks, and they can send billions in hours. When a government needs emergency financing, shadow banking often steps in first. 3. It moves markets at unbelievable speed. Shadow institutions control massive pools of capital. They use high-frequency algorithms. They use leverage. They use borrowing and derivatives to amplify every move. A small action from one shadow bank can move bond markets, stock markets, currency markets, commodities, often in minutes. 4. It buys what banks cannot buy. Traditional banks cannot own huge amounts of real estate. They cannot buy entire companies. They cannot purchase massive portfolios. Shadow lenders can. They buy housing blocks. They buy companies. They buy farmland. They buy infrastructure. Their reach into the real world is deeper than most people think. Section 4. The dangers of the shadow system. Shadow banking creates opportunity, but it also creates enormous risk, because when traditional banks fail, governments can rescue them. They have deposit protections, they have reserve requirements, they have emergency support from central banks. But shadow lenders have none of this. If a shadow banking institution collapses, no one knows the full impact, because they don't openly report their risks. They don't share their leverage, they don't disclose their exposure, they don't reveal their losses. This creates a hidden threat, a silent risk, a ticking time bomb. History has already shown what can happen. 1998 long-term capital management collapsed. It nearly took down the global financial system. 2008 mortgage-backed securities, shadow products collapsed. This triggered the global crisis. 2020 the repo market froze. Governments had to inject trillions. 2023 bond market volatility came from shadow leverage. Each crisis began in the shadows, not in the traditional banking world. And experts fear the next global crisis might also come from shadow banking, because the system is too big, too leveraged, too interconnected, and too invisible. Section 5. Who controls this empire? Shadow banking isn't run by criminals. It's run by the biggest financial institutions on the planet. The same companies that appear in the news, the same companies that manage your retirement funds, the same companies that operate silently behind global finance. These include BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, Blackstone, Apollo, Citadel, State Street, JP Morgan's shadow departments, many private equity firms. They control billions individually and trillions collectively. They lend, they borrow, they leverage, they influence governments. But unlike banks, they are not required to follow strict banking rules. This gives them power and also makes them dangerous. Section 6. What if the shadow system collapses? Imagine this. One large shadow lender collapses. It fails to repay loans. It triggers defaults. Its leverage unwinds. Suddenly, liquidity disappears. Bond markets freeze. Companies cannot borrow. Governments lose funding. Real estate prices drop. Currencies fluctuate wildly. Jobs vanish. Trade slows. This wouldn't look like a normal crisis. It would be invisible at first, quiet, sudden, global, because shadow banks do not tell the public what they are doing. They only show results when it's too late. This is why global economists warn that shadow banking is the single largest unregulated financial risk today. Conclusion: the invisible empire shadow banking is not illegal. Shadow banking is not evil. Shadow banking is not hidden in secret vaults. It is simply unregulated, unrestricted, unlimited. It is the system behind the system, the engine behind the global economy, the network behind governments, the power behind corporate money, the empire behind banks. It controls the flow of capital. It controls liquidity. It controls leverage. It controls credit. And even though most people don't know it exists, their lives are affected by it every single day. When the stock market rises, shadow banking is behind it. When the bond market collapses, shadow banking is behind it. When governments borrow billions, shadow banking funds it. You don't see it. You don't hear it. You don't feel it. But it is always there. Silent, massive, powerful. This is the $100 trillion shadow banking system, the financial empire that no one understands, but everyone depends on.